Hello there, and welcome to the All Day Digital Podcast, where we talk to industry executives and thought leaders to get their perspective on a wide range of factors shaping the communications industry. This podcast is brought to you by CoBank's Knowledge Exchange Group, and I am your host, Jeff Johnston. On today's episode, we get to hear from Mike Romano, Executive Vice President of NTCA, to get his perspective on the $65 billion allocated for broadband from the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. This is a precedent-setting amount of federal support to help bridge the digital divide in rural America, and the program has been designed to address some of the shortcomings found in previous government efforts. And while there's lots to like here, there are some red flags that people should be aware of. Mike's deep understanding of rural broadband and the overall structure of the program makes him the ideal person to talk about this enormous opportunity for rural America. So, without any further ado, pitter patter, let's hear what Mike has to say. Mike Romano, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here today.
Well, thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here. I'm glad to be able to join you and talk about all things rural broadband.
Wonderful, wonderful, excellent. Well, hey, let's talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and specifically for this conversation, the $65 billion that was allocated to rural broadband as a part of that act. Maybe you can just give us a high-level background on what that is and where is that money intended to go.
Sure. Yeah, it's certainly a very exciting, once in a generation, certainly unprecedented level of investment in broadband issues writ large. It's actually broken down into several buckets within that $65 billion. I think the biggest one that most people have focused upon certainly is the BEAD program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, which is roughly $42.5 billion, which goes to NTIA, which is an agency within the U.S. Department of Commerce. Although ultimately, all those funds will flow then to states and territories to then give out for broadband deployment. And those will go to certain areas that are unserved or underserved, as I'm sure we can talk about a little bit. There's also within that other pools of money, and I'm not going to get the exact numbers out here, but it's essentially there's a significant amount of money for what's called the Affordable Connectivity Program, or ACP, which is a program that is essentially almost a successor in many ways to the traditional FCC Lifeline program, focused on making sure that broadband is more affordable, particularly for an expanded base of low-income consumers who may have had adoption challenges with respect to broadband in the past. Then there are pockets of money in there for USDA to do its own deployment program through Reconnect. There is funding for tribal broadband through NTIA again. There is funding for digital equity plans. So there are different pockets of money aimed at solving different pieces of the broadband puzzle. But of course, the BEAD program is, I think, the one that's grabbed the most attention because it's 2/3 of the money in the bill.
Great. So as I understand it, the way the federal government's going about distributing money in the BEAD program is different than what the FCC has done before in, say, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund program. So maybe you can just kind of help me understand a little bit about, the differences between what we're doing with BEAD versus what we've done with RDOF in the past.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in some ways you can look at it as BEAD is intended to be a correction for some of the, if you will, sins of RDOF. In some ways, it may be an overcorrection as well. So we can unpack that a little bit. But I think what you're seeing with BEAD is, let me step back. RDOF was an auction program, a pure competitive bidding program, lowest price won. Essentially, whoever was willing to deliver the best broadband for the lowest possible price won. Now, there was weighting in that based upon what speeds you were promising to deliver and the like, but it was essentially an auction where the lowest bid won. BEAD is different. BEAD, we don't know yet the exact scoring criteria that will come, but BEAD is not being administered through the federal agency in the end. As I mentioned earlier, it's actually going from the Department of Commerce to the states. The states will put forward applications based upon plans they have previously submitted to the Department of Commerce that basically describe how they will use the funds and what kinds of projects they'll put the funds toward. The states will in turn then essentially award those funds to sub-grantees, they're being called, essentially providers or municipalities who want to get into the business or counties who want to get into the business. But in the end, providers of broadband who will use these state funds as an ability to cover their CapEx, or at least a portion of it, in deploying networks that will then deliver the services that meet the NTIA criteria. But again, it's a grant program going through the states, probably a different scoring rubric than just pure lowest bid. I think they'll give weight for things like what kinds of services you're offering, what level of affordability you're making available. Different factors will go into this, and again, a lot of them still to be determined. But it won't be purely a lowest bidder wins program. So in that regard, plus the fact it goes through the states, those are two of the biggest differences. The one other difference I'll just note quickly in the form of potential overcorrection is a lot of folks complained, and NTCA included, that the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the FCC did not do a sufficient amount of vetting of bidders prior to allowing them into the auction. It only vetted them after they had already won, which presented problems when they found out that some of them couldn't perform. There's a lot of upfront accountability in the BEAD program, which I think is a good thing in many ways, but also it remains to be seen if some of that will be a deterrent or maybe an overcorrection in the form of some of the things they ask for that may be more difficult for providers to deliver upon.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I guess the FCC faced some criticism with RDOF, with who they awarded money to or attempted to, I guess, award money to. And then B, if I have it right, they allocated money to areas that maybe didn't necessarily need it. I mean, there was connectivity there already. So I'm curious if you think maybe on the second point, do you think with the states playing a more active role and presumably they would have more local knowledge of where there is and isn't sufficient broadband versus at a federal level? I mean, do you think that we could see some improvements in terms of the markets where the money's allocated, so it's actually going to where it really needs to go, as opposed to where maybe there already is broadband?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's another form of accountability you bring up that is important to note is, the phrase that was used was dollars before deployment, maps before money, or money before maps. In RDOF, essentially the FCC had some idea of where broadband was and was not, but it was based upon a set of maps that everybody knew to be flawed in some respects as well. And again, as I think a correction in this process, what Congress actually required NTIA and the states to do is to use updated maps that the FCC, pursuant to a whole separate law, had to create. Those maps are in the process of being created. In fact, as we're recording this today, we're a couple days away from the deadline for providers to submit their information for those new maps. But then there are a series of challenge processes that go in behind that ultimately should lead to better maps still. And I'll come back to that in a second because I think it's an important piece. But the two challenge processes are, one, the very fabric, the very set of locations that providers are identifying as being able to serve, that in itself, which the FCC created or its contractor created, will be challenged. So ultimately, you should have a much better identification of literally parcel by parcel which locations can and can't be served. And then there will be a separate challenge process for the providers who submit data. Others can come in and say, no, I don't believe that provider can serve this area at that speed. So presuming, this is what I want to come back to, presuming that the Department of Commerce, NTIA, and the states wait for that process to play itself out, including those challenge processes, we should have much better maps.
That's helpful. So it sounds like, if I think about some of the positives of this program, this BEAD program, the upfront vetting, as you've articulated, certainly seems to be a good thing relative to what we've done in the past. So, that's great. And hopefully through the processes that we're going through now, we'll have better maps. Is there anything else that, as you look at this program, Mike, that you'd say, wow, that's really good. I'm glad that, they've structured it that way, that we're focusing on these issues or these opportunities up front?
Sure. I think the one other thing I would highlight as a positive in this is leveraging states. I mean, states, as you mentioned earlier, they're closer to the consumer. Now, again, they're going to be using the FCC maps in the first instance, but then they actually have, even down the line, a further opportunity to use their own mapping data too, to further refine things. So I think in that regard, they're going to be, I think, well positioned to identify areas in need. I think even more importantly, just the incentives. So, I think folks always, federal agencies, they want to do their jobs well, but when you're in a state or a locality you sleep in the bed you make. And so to the extent that you make bad decisions about broadband, you live with the consequences of it. Your constituencies directly live with the consequences of it. So there's a different level of accountability or a different kind of incentive there than if you're sort of legislating from on high in Washington. So I do think that focus more, pushing it out more toward the states, will allow them to make better decisions about what kinds of companies they partner with and what kinds of networks they choose to fund. Because as we've seen again, especially with some of the federal programs in the past, you've had poor decisions made about which providers to fund and what kinds of networks to fund, both of which ultimately have turned out to be bad bets and have led to us needing to have this conversation every few years about how to get better broadband to these places.
Yeah. So, I mean, that fragmented approach at the state level to what you're saying makes total sense to me. I mean, and I guess, different states have different capabilities and so forth. I mean, just any thoughts on, where we are? Like, do most of the states have a broadband office or processes in place to be able to support this program? Or I'm sure some do and some don't. But I mean, any thoughts or, around where we are at the state level?
Yeah, it's a bad joke, but the states are all over the map on this. Some states have done multiple rounds of grant programs in the past, and so have a good amount of expertise in this area. Other states are in a very different stage of evolution where they're just hiring up, or maybe they had people, lost them, and now they have to hire up again. So they are in very different places. I know that NTA has devoted a lot of attention and resources to trying to make sure states have guidance and expertise. NTIA has tried to set up a very structured process. I was fortunate enough to join about 7 or 8 other sort of leading the national trade associations at a meeting of the State Broadband Leadership Network, which NTIA convened in Denver a few weeks ago. And I know they're doing these kinds of meetings to basically help the states ramp up and be ready and know what they're going to run into. But yeah, some states are going to run into problems with this for sure. And there are still some very important unanswered questions in terms of implementation of these new programs that still have to be answered, some of which are going to need to be answered by NTIA, and some of which are actually going to need to be answered by the states themselves. So we're in a very exciting and uncertain time right now. And, I really think there's still work to be done and some time to be spent before we will know how well this program delivers in each state. Of course, I say that's even just to get the program set up. We won't really know, and this is often a problem in broadband funding programs generally, we won't really know how well they do until you actually see the broadband turned up. People have a propensity to basically declare victory the moment they issue the dollars out the door. We've got a lot to do to get there. We've got a lot to do after that.
Yeah, no, for sure. So this might be a difficult question to answer given all the uncertainty that you've talked about, and we're still trying to pull this program together at a more of a tactical level. But I mean, as we sit here today, is there anything, Mike, that you look at and you say, I might have some concerns here, or maybe have some concerns there with the way the rules have been written, or the way you see things maybe going in a certain direction that could be cause for concern?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jeff. There are a series of questions that are still open, and they're open by design. NTIA published a 98-page or so notice of funding opportunity to the states, telling them sort of this is how it works, and to the industry as a whole. But for 98 pages of text, it left a whole bunch of things still to be decided. And some of the most critical ones, I think, and again, looking at it through a prism of rural communities and providers in particular, one of the biggest question marks out there is how the agency, NTIA, will define what is a high-cost area. And this is an important factor for 2 reasons. One is it's a factor in determining how much money each state gets. There's a set-aside of money. So each state gets a full allocation, but then there's a set-aside of money for high-cost areas, and that's going to determine how many high-cost locations you have as compared to the nationwide total. That's going to be the separate allocation for the high cost money, which is about 10% of that $42.5 billion. So how that gets defined is really important because that could mean a big difference for states, in Montana and Texas and others, vis-a-vis more urban states. So that's one, I think, very important question or sort of use of the high cost term. The other place the high cost term factors in is in determining how much matching needs to be provided. So there's a matching requirement that says you have to provide a certain percentage match, 25%, up at least 25%, if you're participating in the BEAD program, and you can get a grant for the remainder. But that is relieved in high cost areas. So how you define high cost areas becomes very important to the economics of a project and the financing of a project, because you may or may not need additional loans or capital, depending on whether you're serving a high cost area as it's defined. So that's one example of an important issue. The other issue I'll throw out, and there are several, but the other one I'll throw out is what's an extremely high cost location. This is really important because what NTIA did was they basically said they believed that the statute that created this program prioritized certain kinds of scalable networks. And they basically have interpreted that as fiber. But they said there may be locations that are extremely high cost, such that at that point it's not cost effective to deliver fiber to those locations. So we'll basically wipe out the fiber preference at that point. Each state gets to choose its own extremely high cost location threshold. And that could go a long way towards determining how far you get fiber out there. And the reason I think this is important is just going back into prior federal programs. You see prior federal programs have basically said, well, since we can't get the best kinds of networks to everybody, we're going to try to do the a bare minimum to everyone. And as a result, every time we come back in 2 or 3 years and say, well, shoot, what we built doesn't serve well enough for 75, 80% of the people. We need to do this again. And so there are crosswinds blowing about how you want to set that extremely high cost threshold that really could have long-term implications for what kinds of networks get built.
So, okay, so just to drill down a little bit, Mike, on the high cost area. So I want to make sure at least I understand it. So is that something that would it be a cost, kind of a cost per passing, for example, that would be set at the federal level, and then each state would then get allocated money based on that federal number? Is that am I getting that correctly, or?
I think that's right. I mean, it'd probably be like an average cost per location or something like that, and they'll say basically that one way of doing it, and again, they haven't described the methodology by which they'll do it, but one probably easy way of doing it would be to say that it's essentially everywhere where the FCC has deemed something eligible for high cost universal service funding, since they already use this as a term, high cost, and that way you've got some interagency coordination. So that's one way of potentially doing it, is to say basically what are the areas that are unserved or underserved that would be qualifying for FCC high cost funding if funding were made available there. But you're right, even that ultimately turns on a look at a census block basis, for example, what's the average cost per location in that census block? So I could see something like that.
Okay. No, that's helpful. And then just to follow up on the extremely high cost areas. So I guess, correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm not thinking about this the right way, but I guess the risk would be if say a state were to set that number maybe too low, then we wouldn't be necessarily in line with the spirit of what the federal government's trying to do, which is push fiber as deep as you possibly can into these markets so that you're future-proofing these networks, as opposed to doing something with fixed wireless, which presumably that would be a technology that would be used in an extremely high-cost scenario. Am I thinking about that right? Or
yes, you are. I think that's exactly the crux of this. Is this becomes that tipping point where you basically, if you will, fly the white flag and say, I don't think I can deliver fiber here, and I'm going to have to use an alternative technology. Again, and I know it's a hard question to judge. Where do you sort of walk the line between wanting to get the best possible networks to as many people as possible, but potentially not having enough money to reach everyone? And you've got certainly a lot of industry players pushing this idea around in different directions. But I do think the key point you make is that the statute itself, in the first instance, really called for priority broadband projects, and we're never going to see this kind of investment in broadband certainly a long time to come. I think it's not unfair to characterize it a once in a generation investment. So do you want to not use this opportunity, capitalize upon this opportunity to the fullest to get the best possible networks out as far as you can? and again, I look back to the prior programs. I mean, every time we've seen a federal program adopt an incrementalist approach to this, the FCC over the last 12 years had a 4.1 standard, then a 10.1 standard, then a 25.3 standard. And each time it's helped to get some better broadband out there, but it's also caused people to look back and say, what a waste of money. And we just don't want to go there again. But, there is concern. Some states will look at it and say, well, I don't think I've got enough. So I'm going to do basically, something less than the best to everybody. And, we'll figure out how to solve for mediocrity again in 5 years.
Great. Okay. So you're obviously in regular discussion with operators. So I'm just curious. I mean, what advice are you, or what advice kind of would you give operators who presumably, many of them want to take advantage of this program? Clearly, there's a lot of outstanding issues and uncertainty at this point. So maybe there's only so much you can do at this point. But what kind of advice would you give those folks who are trying to figure out how to position their business to best take advantage of these federal dollars?
So the first thing I would say is, I know they're imperfect, but look at the current maps that are out there one way or another, figure out where those indicate there are unserved or underserved areas. And unserved would be those lacking even just 25.3. Underserved would be those lacking 100/20 broadband. Take a look, start to game plan, think about, maybe those areas won't be on the map in the end, maybe they will be. But what kind of a business plan, what kind of interest do I have, but then what kind of a business plan could I make to invest in a network in those areas? What would it take as far as CapEx? What would it take to sustain it over, 20-year useful life plus a 20-year plus useful life? And am I interested in doing that? Now, again, those maps will be refined. You may find some of those areas come off. You may find some other areas come on. But look at those areas, especially I think for those areas that are neighboring or naturally sort of areas where one could extend an existing network. Really, I think it's worth people taking a look at that, both frankly, candidly, as an offensive and a defensive measure, right? I mean, it's an opportunity for expansion into new markets that I may not serve today. It may also be a way of helping to make sure that I've got an even larger footprint that is then harder for somebody else to come in and potentially challenge in a way too. So I think there are multiple reasons for providers to be taking a look at this now, at least starting to sketch this out, talking with their management team, talking with their boards, talking with their lenders and folks like you all, of course, and basically saying, what can I do to potentially enter this space, and what would I need to do to be able to do it or start looking at it probably in the spring of 2023.
Yeah, because I've always sort of believed, I mean, that first mover advantage with a fiber network is pretty sticky, right? I mean, if you go into a new market where it's underserved or unserved and you go in and deploy a fiber network and have good customer service, I think you could be in pretty good shape for quite a while, I would think. It would be tough for someone to overbuild you with another fiber network, I would think, anyway.
Right. I mean, there's a reason these places have sat unserved or underserved. And if somebody now coming in looks at you as somebody who got part of their funding, a significant part of their funding covered by a program intended to serve those areas, I would love to see the economic business case they can make to be the second network in that area that could not even sustain one previously without government intervention. So I think it does position people well, and it should factor into their analysis. But again, both I think as an expansion opportunity and as what it means for even their existing footprint, where perhaps it helps them essentially build an even bigger, more impressive coverage area.
Yeah, great. And then what about on the state side, on the state broadband office side? I mean, what should operators be doing with their state officials to be able to execute on this whole plan?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that, actually, because I meant to mention we worked with the Fiber Broadband Association on something called the Broadband Infrastructure Playbook. And we actually have now done 2 iterations of it. One was prior to NTIA announcing their rules, just trying to interpret the law and get state broadband offices up and running. And then the second was post NTIA notice. We've delivered that to the governor's offices. We've delivered that to state broadband offices. We've delivered that to providers, delivered it to the state telecom associations with whom we work. And it's a great soup to nuts sort of flippable walkthrough manual of everything from how do you start to stand up a broadband office to how do you apply for and then implement the BEAD program. And I think that that's a great resource, and I would encourage providers to think about that, look at that, start talking to the state broadband offices about what do you need to do for BEAD, what information do they need from you to help them prepare for BEAD. And I think honestly too, the BEAD program really, it is going to be this collaborative process because the states are the applicants, but the subgrantees are folks they work with.
Well, Mike, look, we've covered a lot of material here. You're clearly the right guy to have on the podcast to talk about this stuff. So thanks for your willingness to participate today. But is there anything else that I didn't ask or we didn't talk about that you would think we should touch on before we wrap it up?
The only other thing I guess I would say is, and this goes again to sort of figuring out the finance or economics of all this. There's a lot of excitement right now about the CapEx components of these programs, the ability to cover some of the upfront costs of investing in these areas. And that's always been a real gating item to getting broadband out into some of these rural areas. But we do know from decades of experience in delivering rural telecommunications, dating back to rural telephony and through rural broadband, that sustainability is an important piece too. And so I would just encourage folks, and I know that folks do this as part of their prudent business planning anyway, and certainly as you all working with the CoBank look to see sort of how do we make sure that these things continue to stay in place and from a rural sort of community development perspective. But it's something I just would let folks know that we continue to impress upon policymakers is the importance not only of getting it out there, but keeping it out there and keeping it affordable and allowing these communities to do the best possible things with it. And so the more that I think folks can think about not only selling the deployment aspects of what they're doing, but then getting the community excited about the use cases for it. That in turn, I think will have a good effect with these state offices as well, with states, to get them excited about what you're going to do. So I think there's a holistic surround sound element to this, getting local and state buy-in on this in a way that goes just beyond the application page or figuring out the financing of it.
Great. Well, look, I think we'll leave it there, Mike. It was a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, great. Well, thank you for having me, Jeff. Appreciate all CoBank does with us, and look forward to continuing the conversation at some point in the future.
And I think the fact that NTIA is trying to ensure that networks built with BEAD money are future-proof to the extent feasible is a very good thing, especially when you think about the rapid digital transformation our society is going through. However, the uncertainty around what constitutes high-cost and extremely high-cost areas could run counter to the spirit of the Act. I also think that with getting the states involved in allocating funds will result in a more effective use of these funds, given their local knowledge and the level of accountability the states have towards their constituents. Hey, thanks for joining us today, and watch out for the next episode of the All Day Digital Podcast.
The information provided in this podcast is not intended to be investment, tax, or legal advice and should not be relied upon by listeners for such purposes. The information contained in this podcast has been compiled from what CoBank regards as reliable sources. However, CoBank does not make any representation or warranty regarding the content and disclaims any responsibility for the information, materials, third-party opinions, and data included in this podcast. In no event will CoBank be liable for any decision made or actions taken by any person or persons relying on the information contained in this podcast.